The Soviet Union? I thought you guys broke up.
Yes, that's what we wanted you to think.
In this video, I'll be taking a quick look at 6 different countries that exist today when they were at their greatest extent in terms of territory, as well as showing a somewhat realistic greater version of these countries that could have been. If you haven't watched my first 2 videos in this series, please click the links in the description to check them out. In the first video, I also provide a more thorough explanation of irredentism and the topic as a whole. But with that said, let's get to it. First off, we'll take a quick look at Thailand. Thailand at its greatest extent controlled essentially all of Southeast Asia with the exception of Vietnam and Myanmar, or Burma, which was a British colony at the time. If you include all lands that have been controlled by Thailand at any point in history, you get this. Thailand has essentially, at one point or another, controlled almost all of Southeastern Asia. But in a more realistic irredentist scenario, you would get something like this. I imagine Thailand could have come to dominate Southeastern Asia if the French never chose to colonize it and take away its Cambodian subjects. It could also have kept slightly more land in the west if the Ayutthaya Kingdom's wars against Burma had been slightly more favorable for Thailand, allowing future Thai kingdoms to keep those lands. Germany is a country which has come close to domination of the European continent more than once. Before the First World War, in the early 20th century, Germany was one of the great powers in Europe and had been catching up to the British economically. It also controlled a significant portion of Europe during the World Wars, both of which ended in German defeat, and finally a partitioning of the country which lasted for much of the 1900s. Germany at its territorial height, that was internationally recognized, looked like this. And at its height during World War II, it occupied approximately this. But of course, Germany keeping all of this is not quite realistic, and I doubt they would have had any chance of winning the Second World War. But still, there are ways Germany could have kept more land. As I like to remain a little more conservative, this is approximately what I see Greater Germany could have been. It would be in a stalemate World War I scenario, or perhaps a scenario where the First World War was avoided. In the late stages of the war, Germany was doomed to lose, especially after the Americans entered on the Western Front. So Germany would have to manage to sign an early peace with no territorial changes in the West, or maybe avoid the war altogether. Another plausible way Germany could be bigger today is if perhaps the Soviets would cede less land from East Germany and giving it to Poland. In this alternate carving up of Eastern Europe, the Soviets would still partition East Prussia, but would allow East Germany to keep Pomerania and Silesia. This would leave their Polish subject quite discontent, and it certainly wouldn't be ideal for the USSR, as the fate of Germany was still to be determined. Speaking of the USSR, now we'll take a look at Russia. Russia at its territorial height during the Russian Empire controlled this area, and if you include their subjects during the USSR, as well as all territory that has been under some Russian control, you get this. But a more realistic Greater Russia today, in my opinion, would look something like this. It would be in a scenario where Gorbachev's reforms succeeded, and they formed the Union of Sovereign States. I made a video on this scenario with Mr. Z, which there should be a link to in the description below. Now let's take a quick look at Spain. Spain was in the 1500s and 1600s a great colonial empire. It controlled this area at its territorial height. And if you include all territories that have been either subjects of Spain or under Spanish occupation, you get this. Assuming the age of colonialism coming to an end was inevitable, Spain would never have kept all these lands, and eventually would lose its colonial holdings. But Spain still could have been quite a bit larger. In my opinion, a realistic Greater Spain would look like this. Portugal was under the Spanish crown for 60 years, and if they had managed to fully integrate it into the country, or if perhaps they were unified earlier, much like Aragon and Castile, Portugal could potentially have been a part of Spain till this day. The region would likely be similar to Catalonia and the Valencia region today, having their own local language and an independence movement. Japan is also a country which certainly could have been larger today and has controlled much more territory. Japan at its height during World War II controlled this, quite a large chunk of East Asia. But much like with Germany, losing the war, especially after their attack on Pearl Harbor, was inevitable. So, a more realistic Greater Japan, in my opinion, would look something like this. It would exist in a scenario where the military didn't manage to completely dismiss the government in Tokyo, and the Japanese Empire would go down a much more democratic path, which it already seemed to be heading towards during the early years of the Japanese Empire. This would mean no annexation of Manchuria, war with China, or a war in the Pacific against the Allies and eventually the US. Japan would simply keep control of Taiwan and Korea and culturally assimilate them by enforcing Japanese language and customs, much like they attempted to do in our own timeline. For the final country, I will be taking a quick look at the small island nation of Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. Trinidad and Tobago was in the late 50s, after independence from Britain, home to the capital of the Greater West Indies Federation. This federation was an attempt to leave the British Empire as a unified country much like Canada, and had it succeeded, it would make Trinidad and Tobago quite a large country. This union staying together is, in my opinion, the most likely Greater Trinidad and Tobago scenario. Of course, this country wouldn't really just be Trinidad and Tobago, but the capital would be there. It would be an extremely multicultural nation, controlling islands all over the Caribbean, and it certainly would be more notable than the many small independent island nations there today. But that's just about all for now. Hope this quick look at a few irredentist scenarios was interesting. If there's anything you would like to share, feel free to leave a comment. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button if you want to see more content like this in the future. Also, stay tuned for the next part in my What If Rome Never Fell scenario. I'll see you guys next time.